Hi, and welcome back to our series of videos during Holy Week. We're looking at Mark's account of the events of the week of Passover in Jerusalem. And today, things are coming to a head. If you haven't been following us, Jesus and his disciples have just celebrated a traditional Passover meal on Thursday after sundown. Then after the meal, probably around 11 to midnight, Jesus goes with his disciples outside Jerusalem to a garden at Gethsemane, where Judas, one of his own disciples, comes with armed guards from the chief priests and hands Jesus over to them. What happens next is a whirlwind of events, and you can read it for yourself in Mark 14, starting at verse 53, but here's what happens. It says that Jesus is led away to the high priests and teachers of the law, who've plotted to kill him, and is tried before the Sanhedrin, and this is the court of Jewish rabbis that would have operated as their court system. And it's in the middle of the night, and this is actually illegal practice for Jews, but at least 23 rabbis are gathered together, and they're calling people forward to give testimonies against Jesus, all of which Mark says fall flat. There are no grounds anyone has that are airtight enough to have Jesus sentenced to death. And Mark even says that the accounts don't match up. So the high priest stands up before everyone and asks Jesus if he has anything he wants to say, but Jesus stays silent. So he asks Jesus one question: Are you the Messiah? Are you the one who's sent by God, the Son of God, the Messiah, the one who would save the Jewish people, everything all Jews would have been waiting their lives for? And so Jesus says, I am. And at that moment, the chief priest tears his robes off and declares that Jesus has committed blasphemy by claiming he's divine, which is punishable by death. And so the entire council condemns Jesus to death and begins to spit on him and beat him. We know all this took place because Peter's been watching from a short distance. In Mark, he's the only disciple who seemed to follow after Jesus when everyone ran away. And he's been in the courtyard this whole time and is now finding himself questioned by some others. People say they recognize him and say, Aren't you with Jesus? And they hear his accent and say, You must have been with him. You sound just like him. And 3 times Peter denies Jesus, finally cursing and swearing with an oath, I don't even know this man. And then he hears a rooster crow nearby, and Peter begins to weep. What Jesus had said to him the night before has happened, that before the rooster crowed twice, Peter would deny him 3 times. And we don't see Peter for a while in this story. He leaves and cries bitterly, and we can assume that he goes into hiding with the other disciples, ashamed of how he could deny knowing one of his closest friends, a man he's followed for the past 3 years. So it's now morning, and Jesus is brought across the city to face Pontius Pilate. But why? Wasn't he just convicted and sentenced to death? Well, yes and no. You got to remember, all of Israel was under Roman rule, so any capital punishment needed to be presented to the Roman governor, and in Jerusalem, that's Pilate. And so all these Jewish leaders had brought Jesus before him, saying that he's broken their religious laws and he deserves to die. And so Pilate asked him a similar question, Are you king of the Jews? To which Jesus replies, You've said it. Jesus is then accused of many things, and Mark doesn't write about those, but he does say that Pilate is amazed at Jesus not defending himself. And it's just like the prophet Isaiah wrote about the coming Messiah and suffering servant about 500 years prior. In chapter 53, verse 7, he writes, He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he didn't open his mouth. But Pilate, seeing no fault in Jesus, and possibly for the sake of keeping peace in front of a growing crowd, follows his tradition of releasing a prisoner during the festival of Passover. And so he presents Jesus, and he presents a man named Barabbas. Mark tells us that Barabbas was with the rebels, and he committed murder during a rebellion. And so Pilate says, Do you want me to release the king of the Jews for you? But the chief priest stirs up the crowd to say they wanted Barabbas instead. So Pilate asks, Then what do you want me to do with this one you call the king of the Jews? And we can almost hear the crowd roar, Crucify him. Why? What's he done wrong? Pilate asks. But they keep shouting, Crucify him. Crucify him. So Mark says, willing to gratify the crowd, Pilate releases Barabbas, the rebel, and has Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. So Jesus is then beaten and he's mocked by Roman guards. They dress him in a purple robe and they place a crown of thorns on his head. They salute Jesus saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," while hitting him on the head and spitting on him. Now after beating him and flogging him just near death, they put his clothes back on him and lead him out to be crucified. So we see Jesus bleeding, back inside, sliced open from flogging. He can't carry his own cross, so a foreigner nearby named Simon, who was in town for the festival, is forced to carry the cross with him to a place west of town called Golgotha, or Skull Place. It's only 9 a.m. now, but Jesus is strapped, and other gospels say he's nailed to his cross and displayed to die a slow and agonizing death. It's so traumatic that a new word is eventually coined to describe death on a cross: excruciating. And on the card saying the charges against Jesus, it simply reads, "The King of the Jews." And Jesus is hung up between two criminals, and Mark says that the chief priests and teachers of the law begin taking their turn casting insults at him on their hands. 3 hours pass by. It's now noon, and Mark tells us that darkness comes over the whole land for another 3 hours until 3 that afternoon, when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It's the opening to Psalm 22. Most likely Jesus is reciting his way through the scriptures he would have learned as a young boy. All Jewish boys would have grown up knowing and memorizing the Psalms, and it's almost like David wrote this song just for him. And then Jesus lets out another loud cry and he dies. And Jesus' friends watch from a distance, and it's like they can see their hopes and dreams have just been shattered right in front of their eyes. This man they've followed for years, who they thought would save Israel, they've seen him bring sight back to the blind people. He's healed people with chronic conditions. He's even brought people back from death. But they've just seen him die. Now it says that evening, Joseph of Arimathea, who's a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, the people who tried Jesus, he goes to Pilate and he asks for Jesus' body. Well, Pilate's even shocked that Jesus is dead, as many victims of crucifixion can last for a few days before passing, and they're often prolonged by family who comes by to feed them and give them water on poles. But Pilate checks with the guards and captains and confirms Jesus' death and allows Joseph to bury Jesus. And so Mark says that Joseph goes to buy fine linen and he wraps Jesus' body and he places him in a tomb and rolls a stone over the entrance. And it says that he does all this while some of Jesus' friends, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, watch close by. And as the city begins to shut down, nightfall comes, as it's now the start of a new day, Saturday, the Sabbath, a day of rest. Jesus' friends and disciples most likely scurry away to hide out. They don't want to end up like their friend. And at the end of Friday, Jesus lies dead in a borrowed tomb, wrapped in fresh linens. Today, we pause to remember Jesus' death and the sacrifice that he knowingly made for us. We remember that during the Passover meal, when Jesus said that his sacrifice, his blood, would be a sign of a new promise between God and his people and would be for many. And today, as darkness falls over Jerusalem, we remember. Thanks so much for joining us today as we remember together. And as always, if you're in the Birmingham area and you don't have a church home, we'd love you to be our guest at Hueytown First this Easter. And we have a traditional service at 10 o'clock and Thrive's modern service at 11. We hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your Friday. We hope we'll see you tomorrow.